Most people will spend their entire lives playing games they were never meant to win. That is not an insult. It is a design feature. And if you do not understand that, then no amount of hard work, no amount of good intention, no amount of clean living, no amount of waking up early and staying late, and no amount of being told you are responsible and disciplined is ever going to fully explain why the rich keep getting richer, decent, hardworking people keep running in place. I want to begin there because I do not think the central financial problem in modern life is that people are lazy. Most people are not lazy. Most people are tired. Most people are obedient. Most people are trying. They go to work, they pay bills, they save what they can. They avoid obvious stupidity. They tell themselves that if they stay patient, if they keep climbing long enough, if they keep doing what respectable people are supposed to do, eventually the system will reward them with more than survival. Sometimes it does. Most of the time it gives them something narrower, respectability, maybe comfort, maybe a decent house, some retirement contributions, a vacation when the year was kind, and the vague feeling that they are one major setback away from realizing how little of their life they actually control. That is not wealth. That is managed participation. And it is a very different thing. What I want to explain to you is why this happens. Not with motivational nonsense. Not with one more silly speech about mindset. Not with moral condemnation of people who stayed poor. I want to explain it structurally, because the truth, as I have come to understand it over a very long lifetime, is that most people stay poor or merely comfortable because they keep playing the wrong games. Not badly the wrong games. That is the distinction that matters. You can be brilliant inside the wrong game and still lose. You can work heroically inside the wrong game and still end up old, tired, and wondering why someone far less disciplined somehow owns the building while you merely help pay for it. You can save dutifully, follow every legal and social instruction placed in front of you, and still discover that the distance between you and true wealth barely moved at all. That is because the game you were taught was not really about wealth. It was about usefulness. It was about making you stable enough to participate and disciplined enough not to question why participation is not producing the freedom you imagined. That is how the system protects itself. It teaches you a version of life that sounds virtuous, reasonable, and safe, then quietly arranges the rewards so that the largest gains flow to people playing a very different game. Now, let's put how we got here. For most of human history, wealth came from ownership, not labor. That is not ideology. That is history. If you own the land, you own the output. If you own the ships, you own the trade. If you own the workshops, you own the margin. If you own the mines, the debt, the root, the mill, the field, the building, the animals, or the tax rights, you own the thing that produced wealth. Everyone else helped convert your ownership into income. That was the old world. And in many ways, it is still the real world, only dressed more politely. What changed during the industrial age was not the basic rule of wealth. What changed was the story told to the people who did not own. The rise of wage labor created a problem for the people at the top. Workers were no longer peasants tied to a field by obvious hierarchy. They were urbanizing, organizing, reading, comparing, noticing. They could see that enormous fortunes were being created around them, and that those fortunes did not belong to the people sweating hardest. That is dangerous if you are trying to maintain order. So a new story had to be built, a story that would make wage labor feel like the honorable path, a story that would make people believe they could reach wealth by climbing carefully inside structures they did not own, a story that would turn endurance into virtue and turn obedience into a moral identity. That story became modern financial common sense. Study hard, get a degree, get a stable job, climb the ladder, save money, avoid risk, follow the rules, invest conservatively. Retire later with dignity. This story is not totally false. That is what makes it so effective. It can produce solvency, it can produce a decent life, it can produce middle class stability for some people in some periods. But it is not the story of how serious wealth is built. It is the story of how systems reproduce disciplined workers while keeping the truly powerful levers of wealth concentrated elsewhere. That is why I say the poor and the wealthy are often playing different games. The poor and the middle class are told to trade time for money. The wealthy try to own the thing that buys the time. The poor are taught to save. The wealthy learn to use leverage. The poor are taught to believe the system is mostly fair. The wealthy learn to study how the system actually distributes power. Those are not small differences. Those differences are destiny if repeated long enough. Let us take the first false game, trading time for money. If you ask the average person how to become rich, he will almost always begin with some version of work harder, get promoted, switch to a better paying job, add credentials, and move upward through salary. This is such a common answer that people stop hearing how strange it really is. Time is finite. Everyone knows this. Even children know this. And yet adults continue telling one another that the path to wealth is to exchange the finite thing they own in equal measure with every other human being for the one thing that compounds most violently for people who stop depending on time. This is one of the great absurdities of modern life. When you trade time for money, you immediately accept two limitations. Your earning capacity is capped by the number of hours you can sell, no matter how well you sell them. Second, the moment you stop working, the engine stops. This does not mean jobs are useless. Far from it. Jobs feed families. Jobs teach skill. Jobs can provide starting capital, structure, discipline, and networks. Jobs can be a bridge. What they rarely are is the final machine of wealth, because wages scale badly compared with ownership. If you are a wage earner, someone else decides how much of the value you help create returns to you. That is the hidden weakness in the salary model. A company can grow tenfold and your compensation may rise modestly. A product can sell all over the world and your hours remain the same. A business owner can make money while sleeping because he owns a productive asset. You, as the employee, must be present. That difference becomes larger every year because scale rewards ownership and barely flatters labor. I have watched intelligent people destroy decades of potential by refusing to see this. They thought higher salary was the same as wealth. It is not. Higher salary is often just more elegantly managed dependence. You may become a better paid worker and still remain trapped in the exact same game. This is why the elite have always preferred ordinary people to worship careers. If people remain focused on wages, they do not ask harder questions about ownership. They do not ask who captures appreciation. They do not ask who gets the tax advantages. They do not ask who gets the leverage. They do not ask who gets the upside when labor scales through systems. They simply run faster inside the treadmill and call the extra speed success. That is the first game, and if you never move beyond it, you can have a nice life and still never approach serious wealth. Now let us go to the second false game, saving. This one is especially cruel because it is marketed as responsible, and in a narrow sense it is responsible. I would always rather see a person save than spend carelessly. Saving teaches discipline. Saving creates a buffer. Saving is better than living on fumes and borrowed money, but saving as a theory of wealth is one of the most overpraised half-truths in modern finance. Why? Because saving alone is linear. Wealth, real wealth, is rarely linear. If you earn $50,000 and save $5,000, then next year you do it again. You are not doing anything wrong. But look at what you are actually up against. Inflation, taxation, housing appreciation, asset inflation, medical shocks, market crashes, rising education costs. The way all major systems quietly move upward in price faster than the saver can comfortably catch them with labor alone. This is why the public can save dutifully for years and still feel as though the horizon keeps retreating, because it often does. The system loves savers who never graduate into owners. Why? Because the saver is easy to manage. He places his money in low-yield accounts. He buys products designed to feel prudent. He accepts modest returns because modest returns look respectable. He waits 40 years for compounding to bless him, while the people above him use leverage, tax strategy, and ownership to capture much larger gains much earlier. This is not an argument against all investing. It is an argument against confusing conservative saving with a complete wealth strategy. There is a difference between storing money and deploying money. The poor and middle class are often taught storage. The wealthy learn deployment. The poor save cash. The wealthy use capital to buy assets. The poor are told slow and safe. The wealthy are taught when to use speed and leverage. The poor are told to be grateful for small yields. The wealthy ask how to control things that appreciate and throw off cash. That is the second game. Saving makes people feel responsible, while ownership makes people rich. Now, I know what some people will say here. They will say index funds work. They do over time. They will say retirement accounts matter. They do. They will say compounding is real. It is. I am not denying any of that. I am telling you that for most people, these tools are not enough to overcome the structural gap between labor and ownership, unless they are combined with a much more aggressive understanding of what wealth actually is. A retirement account can make you safer. It does not automatically make you rich. Not in the way the elite mean rich. Not in the way that changes how power flows through your life. Not in the way that lets you stop depending on permission. That requires another level of play. Which brings us to the third false game, meritocracy. This is the psychological game, the most important one, because as long as ordinary people believe the system is fundamentally fair, they will blame themselves before they question the game. That is incredibly useful if you are benefiting from the game. Meritocracy says work hard, follow the rules, do the right thing, and rewards will flow roughly in proportion to merit. That story stabilizes societies. It also hides enormous amounts of truth. I am not saying merit does not matter. Competence matters, discipline matters, temperament matters, skill matters, but meritocracy as the main explanation of wealth is a comforting myth. The world is far too structural for that. Many rich people are smart, many are not. Many poor people are undisciplined, many are not. Many hard-working people never get rich. Many connected, strategic, or well-positioned people do. Luck matters, family matters, networks matter, geography matters, timing matters, ownership matters, institutional access matters, the courage to do what polite society initially disapproves of matters, the ability to endure being misunderstood matters, the ability to step outside social scripts matters. And none of that fits comfortably inside the meritocracy fairy tale. That is why the fairy tale remains necessary. If the rich believe their wealth is almost entirely earned, they feel morally secure in keeping it. If the poor believe the system is mostly fair, they interpret failure as a personal defect rather than a structural position. That is one of the most effective forms of class control ever invented. It turns inequality into a private shame instead of a public question. And it keeps smart, capable people trapped inside self-blame, while the people actually benefiting from the rules continue using them. Once you understand that, the whole thing looks different. The advice to work hard, save patiently, and trust the system stops sounding noble. It starts sounding functional. Functional for the system, not necessarily for you. Now let us move to the real games. If labor, saving, and meritocracy keep most people stuck, then what actually builds wealth? The first real game is ownership. This is the oldest wealth rule in history, and still own things, own businesses, own equity, own real estate that throws off cash, own intellectual property, own distribution, own brands, own routes, own contracts, own anything that keeps earning when you are asleep. That is the game, because ownership changes the economics. If you own, your upside is not capped by hours. If you own, appreciation works for you. If you own, inflation can help you instead of only hurting you. If you own, the labor of many can scale your wealth instead of only your own. That is why the elite focus on assets rather than salaries. Salaries pay for life. Assets change class position. Now, if you are starting from nothing, ownership sounds frustratingly far away. You cannot simply snap your fingers and own an empire tomorrow, but the principle remains the same whether the asset is large or small. The question is not, how do I quit my job and own everything immediately? The question is, how do I begin shifting from being paid only for labor toward owning things that can pay me? This may begin very modestly, a small business, a side service with repeatable systems, a digital product, an audience, a tool, a property share, a piece of equity in something someone else is building. The form matters less than the logic. Wealth begins moving differently the moment you own a productive claim instead of only selling hours. That is the first real game. The second real game is leverage. Now this is where people get nervous because leverage is powerful and power frightens people who were raised on worker rules. Worker rules say debt is bad, stay safe, avoid complexity. Wealth rules ask a different question. Can I use other people's money, time, systems, or resources to create a return larger than the cost of using them? That is leverage. Debt is one form of leverage. Other people's labor is another. Other people's distribution is another. Other people's audiences, code, infrastructure, machines, platforms, and capital are all forms of leverage. The reason leverage matters so much is simple. Saving is linear. Leverage is geometric when used correctly. If you save $10,000 a year, that is one kind of growth. If you use borrowed money or strategic capital to control an asset that appreciates or throws off returns at a much higher rate than your labor could produce alone, you are playing a completely different game. This is why the wealthy think about debt differently. They do not fear all debt. They fear stupid debt. They avoid debt that finances consumption and embrace debt that finances productive assets. That is a major distinction. A worker borrows for a car that loses value. An investor borrows for an asset that may pay the debt down for him. A consumer uses credit to preserve lifestyle. A strategist uses leverage to acquire cash flow and appreciation. Same financial system, different game. This is why I always tell people that what matters is not whether you borrow. It is what the borrowing buys you. And yes, leverage is dangerous. Very dangerous when used badly. It magnifies stupidity as effectively as it magnifies wisdom. That is why poor people who are told only to avoid it never learn the more important lesson, which is how to use it intelligently. Avoiding all leverage keeps many people safe. It also often keeps them small. Now, I am not advising recklessness. I am advising literacy. The inability to distinguish productive leverage from destructive leverage is one of the great barriers between the middle class and real wealth. The third real game is understanding how the system actually works. Some people call this rigging the system. I prefer a cleaner phrase, reading the incentive map, because that is what it really is. The tax code is an incentive map. The legal structure is an incentive map. Financing markets are an incentive map. Political access is an incentive map. What does the system reward? What does it subsidize? What does it punish? What does it allow the wealthy to do quietly while discouraging ordinary people from even asking the question? That is the map. The average person treats rules as walls. The wealthy often treat rules as terrain. That is one of the most important mindset differences in all of finance. A worker asks, "What are the rules?" A strategist asks, "Who wrote them? Who benefits from them? And how do I position inside them?" That is how tax minimization works. That is how business entities work. That is how depreciation works. That is how debt advantages work. That is how lobbying works. That is how regulation often works. The poor are taught fairness. The wealthy study advantage. That is why I say understanding the system is the third game. You do not have to break the law to do this. Most fortunes are not built through open criminality. They are built through structural fluency, knowing where the gain sits, knowing which doors are legal but unknown, knowing how to position an asset, an entity, a payment, a contract, or a holding, so the system treats it differently. That is how adults with power actually play. Now, if you hear all of this and think, fine, then why doesn't everyone just do it? That is a fair question. The answer is not that the real games are hidden in a vault. The answer is that the average person is kept too tired, too obedient, too risk-averse, too morally managed, and too busy surviving the false games to study the real ones properly. That is the trap. The labor game takes your time. The saving game takes your urgency and turns it into patient underperformance. The meritocracy game turns your frustration inward and makes you think your lack of wealth is mainly a reflection of insufficient virtue. That combination is devastating. It creates a person who works hard, saves modestly, trusts authority, and blames himself. That is the perfect worker. It is not the profile of a future elite owner. This is also why the self-help industry is so useful to the system. It tells people their problem is mindset. Maybe they need more hustle. Maybe they need a better morning routine. Maybe they need sharper confidence. Maybe they need to read one more book about productivity. That is not always useless, but very often it is a form of misdirection. It encourages people to decorate the inside of the wrong game instead of leaving it. It makes them better at enduring bad structures rather than better at replacing them. That is one reason so many hardworking, conscientious people remain financially trapped while thinking they are improving. They are improving at surviving, not at owning. That is a tragic difference. Now let us become practical. If you are starting from nothing, how do you begin moving from the false games to the real ones? You do not quit your job tomorrow and announce yourself free. That is fantasy. You start by changing the direction of your effort. You keep the job if you must, but you stop worshiping the job. You use labor to build the first asset. You use skill to buy time. You use time to build ownership. That is the bridge. Most people do not get stuck because the bridge is impossible. They get stuck because the bridge is exhausting and takes longer than they hoped. They want immediate freedom. The system rarely allows that. It allows strategy, which means you may need to work two jobs in effect. The visible one that pays bills and the invisible one that builds ownership. That is the path. A small business on the side, a skill turned into repeatable income, a service converted into equity, a property acquired carefully, a product built once and sold repeatedly, a piece of IP, a cash-generating asset, anything that starts the transition from labor, only economics to ownership economics. That is how people starting from nothing do it. Not quickly, strategically. The second practical shift is to stop worshiping cash accumulation for its own sake and start studying acquisition. What asset can I control? What productive thing can I buy? What can I build that earns without me present every minute? What form of leverage becomes sensible once I understand it well enough? What tax structure or entity do I need to learn instead of fear? Those are the questions adults ask when they stop playing the poor games. The third practical shift is emotional. You must become comfortable being seen as strange. This is not a small thing. Most people stay poor because the social cost of deviating from the script feels higher to them than the financial cost of remaining inside it. Family will question you, friends will think you are arrogant, colleagues will call you unrealistic, conventional people always attack unconventional moves before results arrive. Later, they reinterpret the same moves as brave. That is how humans protect their dignity. They mock first, then imitate. You must survive the first stage. That is a real price. Now let me say something blunt. There are people listening to ideas like these who will turn them into an excuse for bitterness. That is useless. Seeing the system clearly is not permission to whine. It is permission to act intelligently. You cannot rebuild your life with resentment alone. You rebuild it with skill, positioning, and ownership. If the game is rigged, then learn the leverage points. If meritocracy is incomplete, then stop waiting for moral fairness and start building useful asymmetry. If labor alone does not produce wealth, then let labor finance the first step into ownership. That is how adults respond. Not by crying about structure, by reading it and moving. So let me bring this all together. The three games that keep people poor are labor for money, saving without ownership, and trusting meritocracy as a complete explanation of how wealth works. The three games that build wealth are ownership over labor, leverage over mere saving, and learning how the system actually allocates reward. That is the difference. The poor are told to be useful. The wealthy learn to be positioned. The poor save. The wealthy acquire. The poor follow rules. The wealthy study which rules matter, which rules are suggestions, and which rules were written to keep them outside the real game. That is why fortunes appear to outsiders as though they emerged from luck, genius, or magic. Often they emerge from somebody refusing the worker script early enough to redirect his life before time made the script permanent. That is what I want for you. Not cynicism, not fantasy. Clarity, because once you see the real games, you cannot unsee them. And once you cannot unsee them, you face the real decision. Keep playing the poor games because they are familiar and socially approved, or begin the long, difficult, strategic transition into the games that actually create wealth. That choice is the beginning of everything. The system will not make it easy. It was never designed to. But it is still a choice. And the worst thing you can do now is understand the real games and then go back to pretending the false ones were ever going to save you.